Welcome to Join the Dots. I'm Sandhu.
And I'm Kennard.
Today we're going to be talking about the world's new oil, data. We've been covering data, privacy and fintech all of this month on Real Media. Now, the other week, Wired released a long read called Big Data Meets Big Brother as China Moves to Rate Its Citizens. This was about the development of the social credit system that would rank the trustworthiness of citizens from data as part of a national score. Ultimately, this will have effects on who gets a mortgage, on where your kids go to school, and it will rate you on things like who you know, how much you watch TV, and where you hang out, and whether that's a positive or a negative. The Chinese government said that this would enhance trust and build sincerity, and it starts as a voluntary process, becoming mandatory by 2020.
And we know how much information data giants like Google and Facebook have about us, but what we don't talk about enough is what they're doing with this information and what impact it's going to have on our lives into the future, because all this data is stored from the first time we use one of their services, and we don't think consciously enough about what that means for our privacy, for our future, financial future, and every other part of our life.
So one of the companies that will be providing some of this information to the Chinese government is a credit scoring agency called Sesame Credit. That's one of the two big Chinese data giants. And they create credit ratings from the information that they gather, because financial companies have been one of the most aggressive and advanced data gatherers, because they're most interested in creating some kind of profile about you to figure out whether you're creditworthy. Douglas Merrill, the former chief information officer at Google, coined the phrase all data is credit data, which means that all the information that you create online could be used in some way to affect your credit rating. So how does this play out with our information? In May, we spoke to Beverly Skeggs, sociologist at Goldsmiths, and she had just completed some research about Facebook and how it's able to track you. Here she is explaining what this phrase means.
Every time you use any device whatsoever, you're sending signals about your behaviour that will be used in a model to predict what your credit rating could be, depending on who's buying that data. It's being assessed for its value. For some people, if it's assessed as being high net worth individuals, it will be put up for auction and traded. For others, it will be profiled and possibly siloed into a low net worth category, where less interest will be putting adverts on their browser by advertisers who will be competing to buy particular data.
How much do we know about the data broker industry?
Oh, very, very little. They are beyond regulation. They refuse to appear before the US Senate or the Federal Commission. I'd say we know very, very little about them. They are the real dark side of the net, because they are the people who are compiling, assessing, classifying and trading your data. And for a new generation, if you are a child born now, they will be assessing your data right from the start. So they'll be building profiles on you. We have no idea how we know how they're doing it. We can find out how they're doing it, but we have no idea what you're being traded for, what your value is, the literal economic transaction we do not know. So they are, I would say they are the most powerful forms of classification that we now experience socially.
And who do they sell this information to?
Well, they sell it to each other. They will sell it to banks. They will sell it to other data companies. So say Experian, in our research, we found a lot of Experian and Axiom on Facebook. So they will be selling the data to Facebook. Facebook will be selling data to them as well. So there's a lot of trade as they're all trying to work out who are the high worth individuals that they can sell on to either banks or advertisers.
So that was Beverly Skeggs talking to us in May about her Facebook research. She told us at the time that Facebook had recently patented the right to use your social circle, so who you know and your friends, in their ratings that they create about you. And Facebook has, you might have seen a kind of stream of stories about the kinds of things that they've been doing with data in terms of buying information from other companies, tracking you when you're off the platform. And a lot of these companies are financial companies like Axiom and Experian, who will be making these kinds of credit ratings about you.
And it's very hard to escape the pressures to take part in these platforms, because now, with your credit rating being decided on your use of Facebook or other platforms, you really don't have the option of just shying away from it all, because there's many things that you need in society that now that there's a prerequisite that you use these platforms. And from The Daily You by Joseph Turrow, we have an example of the kinds of categories and reputation silos that are used, such as soccer and SUVs, mortgage woes, first digs, and so on.
Now, these are the categories that are used to make decisions about you, like what ads you're going to be shown, what rating you're going to get. But the ways that they actually put this information together to create these categories is totally new, and it's not just the ways that we might think about in terms of our age, our name, our location. There are loads of different ways that they're able to gather this information. We spoke to Dr. Tom Fisher, who's a research officer at Privacy International.
In some important ways, we are losing control over our identity. They are building up these one single picture of us based on the data they gather about us. So we no longer have control over how we present ourselves, who we are. For instance, there is Kenyan credit scoring apps, which on a daily basis will upload the entire contents of your phone to their servers, then analyze it to offer people credit based on things like how you organize your address book, whether you write in capital letters, even things like how often you call your mother now affect your credit rating. So the fintech sector is really about that expansion in the use of data and the amount of data they're gathering about us to make these judgments. One concerning development is the way that when we fill in an online form to apply for credit, for instance, how we fill in that form now becomes more important than what we write on it, because they're analysing information like what device you're using. Are you using a high-end iPhone? Therefore, you're more likely to be rich and wealthy, versus a lower-end Android device. And also things like your location. And they can map this in quite detailed ways to know whether you live in a place where they're considered less likely to repay your loan. We used to call these kind of things redlining for mortgages, where certain populations and certain groups were discriminated against because of where they lived.
And that was Tom Fisher talking about how we are losing the ability to decide how we present ourselves, and also how increasingly companies can get hold of information about us which they might not have been able to get before this new technology existed, and had to go through convoluted channels and really abide by the law. And now there's a lot of information about us out there which can be accessed without our knowledge and without our consent.
This is totally different to a normal kind of capitalist transaction, because the value of the data isn't the same as a kind of buying a coffee somewhere, because they're able to have this longer relationship with the things that you're giving up. There was an article in the FT that said that called Big Tech Makes Vast Gains at Our Expense, which explained this and talks about the huge power imbalance that takes place in these kinds of transactions.
And another way that people are conned is that the companies make it as difficult as possible to actually read their privacy policies. I think one lawyer said that it would take a year to read the privacy documents for the average person's number of apps on their phone. So obviously no one's going to do that, and everyone sort of knows when you get that box that asks you to read the privacy policy, you don't really do it, you just sort of press accept. So they dine out on the fact that they know people aren't going to check what's happening, and I don't think that's really going to change.
This comes back to this idea that internet marketers use, that customers are getting a fair deal for using these services online, for using free service. They should get access to your data. What's in reality, we're not actually getting that fair deal. And here's Tom Fisher explaining one example of why not.
I was speaking to a friend of mine a couple of months ago who was using a fitness tracker tied to her insurance company, and she would get a free smoothie every month in exchange for basically having her location tracked constantly wherever she was. If you think about what kind of things something as simple as location data reveals about you, you know from that where someone lives, where someone works. You probably could work out where their boyfriend or girlfriend live, their wife, their mistress, all these people based on their movements, where you go, where you like to shop, all these things. So in exchange for a free smoothie, in the case of a health insurer, you're giving them all this knowledge and information about your life. And so it can't be this fair deal or fair trade between us and the companies to doing this.
So that was Tom Fisher from Privacy International explaining one example of why we don't get a fair deal for our data.
And research by Joseph Turo in 2015 found that most people in America were not evaluating the privacy conditions of any of the apps they were using. They were more in a state of resignation about the fact that their data was being taken by these companies. There was no sort of informed decision-making process at all.
And Tom Fisher mentioned in that example the health insurance companies. There was an article in Bloomberg by Cathy O'Neill where she talked about what would happen to healthcare insurance industries when big data gets involved. And she said that it would essentially encourage these companies to price out the sick and put up the prices on healthy people, which completely defeats what the risk pooling nature of insurance is meant to be about. But these are corporations who want to make a lot of money, and that's something that we perhaps need to remind ourselves when we talk about big data and technology and how positive we can often be about it.
I was going to say, I mean, essentially, what needs to happen is there needs to be a Magna Carta for the internet age, and there needs to be a new Bill of Rights that deals with the new technology we've dealt with, because people are not aware of this as an issue that is going to impact on our everyday lives. Some kind of movement needs to start to ensure the privacy of people and to actually take these companies to court and stop them being able to mine the data.
But it's something that's totally worked in their favour, though, because I think people also are not just in a state of resignation, but kind of tired and can't figure out what is actually going on in terms of their information. So they hear that, yeah, tracking your location is really, really bad, but like, what are people doing with these bits of information? And the reality is that this is something that could affect your life, could affect your standing, your next application. I mean, the whole modus operandi has been to like obfuscate that people don't know what they're actually capable of. But
one way round it as well is that you get technologists producing products that have privacy issues in mind. So that and then outflanking the big data companies. So that happened with WhatsApp with their encryption. They didn't encrypt, and then other services like Telegram and other ones came online, and people that were usable. So people switched to them. And WhatsApp, although they said the fact that they started encrypting was all some sort of idealistic thing. I think one of the guys said that he grew up in the former Soviet Union and knew how bad government surveillance could be. That's why they did it. That was rubbish. What was happening was they were getting outflanked by other technologies which were using encryption, and people, and so that could happen with all these big companies. And I think that after the Snowden revelations, a lot of them had to change how they operated, at least in a PR sense, because. Sure. People are, although everyone sort of suspected what was happening, Snowden really blew the lid on it. And if you could get a Facebook where your data wasn't mined and sold on to corporations, people would start using it tomorrow. So that could happen, and hopefully that will. Fingers
crossed. You've actually got a book coming out soon, which is about corporations and the shadow world that they operate in.
The book we're doing is about the mechanisms that corporations use to obtain power. And obviously, a major way that a corporation can gain power is to have information about the citizenry. Now, the major thesis of the book is that the state is actually being eaten by the corporation. And there's just been a trend since the corporation existed as an institution that it's eaten bit by bit away at the state. Essentially, Facebook now probably holds more information, or definitely holds more information about the populace than the state does. So what does that mean, especially as the state's shrinking and it has less and less people employed directly by it, and most things are subcontracted out to private corporations. So it's all part of the same thing. The power imbalance is such that I don't really think there's really many ways we can fight back at the moment. And as we've said, the resignation issue is a major one with technology. People just don't care. That people are aware that their information is being used, but that does not transfer at the moment into an anger or at the company doing it. And I think that until things start happening, where people are put in prison or people can directly link having to pay increased insurance premiums, nothing much will happen. But that will happen eventually.
Well, we spoke to Brett Scott, who's a financial activist and author, about the kind of short-term problems that technology has gotten very good at solving. And here he is talking about what kind of problems that leaves for us in the long term.
The general modus operandi of the technology sector more generally, not only the financial technology sector, is that you fixate upon short-term problems, or you artificially create short-term problems, or else fixate upon kind of banal short-term problems, and you sell stuff like that to people. You say, I sell you a solution to your short-term problem. But what we'll never tell you about is the long-term consequences of all of you using our short-term solution. Which is because you can't sell long-term consequences. So like, think about the standard startup pitch format. If you ever go to any startup pitching contest, they always have this format, which is like, I've identified a problem. Here's my solution for the problem, and here's how you monetize the solution, right? And here's how you market this to people. This is what you tell them, the short-term use value of this thing, right? And that's the only thing that a venture capitalist is going to back, because that's the only thing you can sell in the short term, right? And so there's this whole sort of structure of capitalism which involves having to pitch short-term solutions. At an individual level, that might be fine, but when you start to like zoom out and you look at the collective effects of these things, you'll find people being locked into gigantic sort of systems that they do not understand. You know, our mobile phones are a very good example of this. These would be pitched as being, you know, useful things, which they are, but just like, oh, by the way, we also created like a huge surveillance system to track every moment of your life in the process of offering you these useful things. We didn't really mention that in any of the startups that created this type of technology. So that's the big problem that you'll find. And there's no economic incentives for people to ever tell you what the implications of the technology are. So there's a chronic sort of problem in technology ethics right now, where startup entrepreneurs are rewarded for their individual successes, but are never asked to take responsibility for the collective consequences of all of this technology put together. And that's been going on for a long time. But you know, there's some cool stuff you could do with technology too. I'm not like totally against it. I'm just like sick of the overwhelmingly sickly sweet kind of insipid optimism around technology.
So let's talk a little bit about algorithms, because Cathy O'Neill, who we mentioned there with the Bloomberg article on health insurance and big data, she wrote an excellent book called Weapons of Math Destruction, which was all about algorithms. She's also got a great TED Talk, if you want to check that out, which was about not putting blind faith into big data. She basically explains how these algorithms, which are increasingly deciding who gets a loan, who gets access to some kind of service, who gets an interview, these can replicate the kind of biases that we hold in our daily lives. And so it matters very much who is making this and how much these algorithms are checked, and that they exploit people's fear of maths and science to get them to not ask any questions about what goes into this algorithm and what it takes to work these things out. There's a feeling that because it's a machine spitting out an answer that it's kind of objective, but it will just automate the status quo, in the words of Cathy O'Neill. In her book, Douglas Merrill, the man behind the "All data is credit data" slogan, he now runs a company called Zest Finance, which was designed to be kind of a better rate than payday lenders. In this short excerpt, she explains what can happen in terms of feedback loops that are created from these algorithms.
Merrill proclaims that all data is credit data. In other words, anything goes. Zest Finance buys data that shows whether applicants have kept up with their cell phone bills, along with plenty of other publicly available or purchased data. As Merrill promised, the company's rates are lower than those charged by many payday lenders. A typical $500 loan at Zest Finance costs $900, after 22 weeks, 60% lower than the industry standard. It's an improvement, but is it fair? The company's algorithms process up to 10,000 data points per applicant, including unusual observations, such as whether applicants use proper spelling and capitalization on their application form, how long it takes them to read it, and whether they bother to look at the terms and conditions. Rule followers, the company argues, are better credit risks. That may be true, but punctuation and spelling mistakes also point to low education, which is highly correlated with class and race. So when poor people and immigrants qualify for a loan, their substandard language skills might drive up their fees. If they then have trouble paying those fees, this might validate that they were a high risk to begin with and might further lower their credit scores. It's a vicious feedback loop, and paying bills on time plays only a bit part.
So that was an excerpt that explained how these algorithms can create feedback loops that just reinforce your social position, or perhaps leaves you even worse off because of all this new information that's being used to make decisions about you. And now we've got Tom Fisher again, who's also explaining why it's important to pay attention to who is making these algorithms.
On the one hand, you've got the sets of the you've got the people who are writing and developing these algorithms, often far, far away from the groups that are being affected by things like alternative credit scoring methods. These are often credit scoring aimed at the poorest and most vulnerable, people without traditional credit files. A lot of growth in Africa on these kind of projects. Yet you have these being written by, computer scientists, data scientists in California. So we have to understand how these algorithms are developed and work, because it's so easy for these to discriminate against certain groups. We see in predictive policing, where the predictive policing algorithms are predicting crime rates based on historical data, but these historical data gathered by police forces which themselves had certain ideas about race and were recording crimes differently for black people versus white people. We then see an algorithm reflecting those biases.
We've also been following the advancement of the biometric ID scheme in India, which now has more than 1 billion people enrolled and is the world's largest biometrics database. While it started as voluntary and just some kind of ID to help you get your provisions, your welfare provisions, it's become increasingly mandatory and it's expanded quite quickly. This has linked a lot of other details to this biometric ID, which includes your iris scan, your fingerprints, and a photograph for facial recognition. It also includes stuff like your marriage registry, and it's increasingly demanding that you need this ID card to file stuff like your tax records. This is creating one of the biggest kind of mass surveillance projects that the world has seen, and it's continuing apace. However, there are activists fighting back.
And there was recently a battle at the Indian Supreme Court. A bunch of activists took the government to court over this invasion of privacy, and they won against the government, who were arguing that they didn't have a right to privacy. That case isn't over. The Supreme Court ruling that Indians did have a fundamental right to privacy was a big, big win. However, the activists are still fighting on other elements of this ID system. And we spoke to Usha Ramanathan, who is a law researcher out in India, and we talked to her about the kinds of arguments that the government used to take away people's privacy.
And the Attorney General said not only that there was no fundamental right, but that there was no right to privacy. So that was one dramatic moment when a whole host changed in the public eye. Then, of course, earlier this year, he helped us further by telling the court that we don't, what makes them think people have a right, an absolute right over their bodies. Now, the point about these questions, as we quickly realized, is not that the question was being asked by the wrong person, and therefore the question itself was wrong. Plainly, the question is not, why do you think you have a right to privacy? But why does the state think it needs to take away our right to privacy? And it's not about our having absolute right to over our bodies. Why does the state feel the need to deny it? And then, of course, somewhere along the argument in the court, the Attorney General also said, they were arguing about the right to be forgotten. And the Attorney General said, you may want to be forgotten, but the state will never want to forget you. It was plainly telling us that here we are, we have power over you. And we will use that power to keep you where we want you. I understand to a certain extent that when technology comes in, this excitement, you might, but at some point you have to pause and see if it's okay or not. And if it's okay for a state to function like this, that pausing never happened. With this government, it's a kind of aggression that you don't see in democratic states. And a kind of coercion that you will never see in a democratic state. So it is saying that we have power and we can penalize you and we can paralyze you. So you better do our bidding or else. And I don't know how they think they would use all this information, but like many other people, even the corporates don't know the various ways in which they use the information. But having all of this data gives them opportunities to create ways in which they can use the data. So the first thing is databasing, seeding it in every database, converging, creating the potential to converge all of this. Then we'll see how we use it.
So the seeding, which Ramanathan was talking about there, was the idea of using these mobile phone numbers in places like courtrooms or shops, or to find out where these people had been. That is then attached to your ID number. So this finds out like where you've been, where you hang out, and it also where you don't hang out, I guess. There was a point that Ramanathan made in there, which is that biometrics has advanced in kind of countries where there's lax regulation and poor populations. Tom Fisher talked about Kenya, but further in Africa and in India, biometric ID has been aggressively pushed on the populations, whereas we kind of just see it here on iPhones and maybe at passports and at borders. But over in these kinds of countries, it's far more aggressive and there's far more coercion with tech companies and the state.
And they often pair it with medical projects and different things. So they say to people, we'll treat you if you give us your data, So, and a lot of people, obviously, in those sort of countries can't say no to that. So I know I also came across that DFID, the aid arm of the British government, funding quite a lot of biometric data programs in the developing world. So that's taxpayers' money from here going towards getting people, getting their data in the developing world.
Was it the... One of the things that came out when the privacy ruling was made was that it was a WikiLeaks release, but there'd been kind of suspicions by Ramanathan actually that these companies, the biometric ID companies, were largely US companies that were private homeland security contractors. So all this information was going back to the US deep state, and the WikiLeaks release was that they had a software that was taking all this information from these biometric software companies back to the CIA.
Yeah.
So.
Well, and the other thing that we haven't really talked about is these are platforms that are used knowingly by people, but there's obviously the technology that's made in the West mainly, which surveys people in ways that they're not aware of. So the UK and the US lead the world in producing cyber technology, which can be used by repressive governments to spy on their own citizens. So here we have a major one called Gamma Group. I'm not going to say too much, I don't want to get sued, but they are very powerful, and they were exposed as providing technology to the dictatorship in Bahrain. And that is another element of all this. I mean, and the privatization of the security state itself. So if you look at who Snowden was working for when he leaked, he was working for the NSA, but he was working for a private contractor, Booz Allen Hamilton, which was gathering data for the NSA. Now that in itself should scare everyone, because of course they're giving the government go-ahead to survey, but that information is essentially held by a private company and they can do what they want with it. And it also, I mean, it backfires against the government itself, because Snowden would have been much more difficult to happen if it was all kept within the state, because as soon as you start subcontracting, you let a lot of people into and a lot of interest into information that they really shouldn't have.
Well, we're going to go back to Usha Ramanathan now, because we asked her why this situation in India was important worldwide, and here she is talking about why the interests driving it are corporate interests that are having an effect on us all?
These are the multinational corporate interests, and these are also interests which are relatable to intelligence agencies and governments having interest in other governments and other peoples. So that's the second thing. And the third is that actually data, like they keep telling us now, is the new oil. And so if the 20th century was dominated by oil, this century is going to be dominated by data. But if we thought it was only about data in terms of, understanding the world around us, it is the market now demands new products, and human beings have become that product in a sense. I mean, we are now generating data, and that Mr. Nilekani here now calls it the trickle-up phenomenon, where he says the people of this country don't have wealth, but they do have data. So if they can't buy with us in the market, they can certainly give us their data, so the data will trickle up, and then wealth will be created. The way it's being said now, when it started, it was said that what we have is data, and we leave digital footprints, and those digital footprints, like fintech companies, for instance, will be willing to provide us services without asking us for too much in terms of transaction fees, but they will just ask for our detailed information about ourselves, and then they can give us credit. So credit became the key to explaining why it's all right to collect all our data. So today when they say trickle up, they say, well, if you have only data about yourself, give it to us, you will get something in return. So you will get credit, and we'll be able to watch you and give you what you want. So the most interesting thing I think about this project is that it's not a project that has been promoted by the state. It has been pushed using state power.
Right.
Promotion has come by using state power, but it's been promoted in marketing terms like most other things are marketed.
So that was Usha Ramanathan talking to Real Media about what's going on in India at the moment. She also mentions that the companies that have pushed this kind of payment technology and also these biometric ID schemes have said that this is about financial inclusion. However, financial inclusion also means financial literacy, whereas these people haven't been told anything about the kinds of systems that they're being put onto and that they can't essentially escape. Bev Skeggs, who we saw at the start of this, she said in a piece that we recently wrote that this was demonstrative of the stealth by which these companies enter people's personal lives.
There's been a big push for digital payment platforms and fintech technology in India. And here we see a softer version of that with this push that cashless society is going to be the great progressive hope for the future.
We spoke to Brett Scott about how these fintech companies and the financial industry promote their ideas for the future as a kind of inevitable thing for society.
What the technology industry often will do is to speak about a future that they would like to see and present it as being completely inevitable and obvious that it will happen. All right, so a lot of the sort of tech futurism is really the sort of desires of technology companies projected out as being obvious things that will supposedly will happen. So when people are saying, we're inevitably moving towards a cashless society, we're inevitably going to this, it's largely the marketing departments of the financial technology companies that are trying to create this sense that this was what you want, right? So, and this is why the companies like Visa, for example, will be running all their adverts all the time in London saying, cash-free and proud. They're trying to engineer this feeling that there's something wrong with cash. I mean, cash is a public utility, right? Anybody can use it. There's no requirement to be interacting with a private company in order to be using cash. Whereas private companies have to advertise and make themselves desirable, which is why they're on this kind of offensive against cash, so on private payments companies. But yes, the financial technology industry more generally has a lot of agendas in trying to tell us that there's this inevitable automation and digitalization of finance. And there's the banks, who are the sort of underlying layer, then there's the payments companies and the fintech companies that are built on top of that. And all of them have agendas in pushing for cashless society because Cash represents a form of payment that they don't make any fees from.
We've talked about like many elements of how this fintech industry and how the financial technology industry is advancing aggressively into our lives and making these kinds of decisions about us. Will this change in the coming years as a generation of people grow up with this information being held about them and these decisions being made? Will it affect the way that we are online? Would it mean that we change or think about who's in our social circles based on what's better for our credit rating? Do you think that's what's going to happen?
I think so, and I think it probably already is happening. Maybe not in the sort of literal ways you're talking about, but people are aware that prospective employers will be looking at their social media. Yeah, exactly. That potentially stuff about you will be kept for forever and could come out at a later date. But I also think that technology, as I said earlier, will in some ways catch up, and that different platforms will have to come up to replace the ones that obviously don't have our best interests at heart. Like, for example, cryptocurrencies is quite an interesting one now, because firstly, because Bitcoin's just got skyrocketed in a couple of months, but also because it does bypass the state in a way that we've never been able to do as a civilization, with fiat currencies, which have been around since the time of capitalism began, whereby the central bank allied to the government can print money when it wants, and there's no real accountability mechanism. Now, dispersed network currencies have really bypassed it, and I think probably the price spike in Bitcoin is a sign that people see it as the future, because the networked model is what's going to happen. So in summary, corporations can get as much information about you as possible in nefarious ways as a means to control you and sell that data on, or corporations can be founded on the idea that privacy is an important thing and we should respect that, and we will not give your data to other people to make money off. And of course, in the marketplace, the latter will win, because most people want a good product allied with their privacy rights being guaranteed. So the incentive, even in a sort of capitalist sense, is to provide services which are allied with privacy rights. At the moment, it hasn't happened, but we're at the start of this whole thing. We've only just begun.
Yeah. And I agree. We've talked about, like, I suppose, the bad potentials of technology, because it's not something that's articulated, and we haven't got to a point where we're discussing privacy. And I think that we do need new regulation. There is some e-regulation, the general data protection regulation that's coming in, and it's a step in the right direction. There's a lot more work that needs to be done. Whether we're going to come anywhere close to keeping that after Brexit, I'm not sure. It doesn't look like May's very concerned about people's privacy. I think also if people start igniting a conversation about privacy and human rights, it's something that's been so eroded and so pushed aside by companies like the big tech elites that we see now, that hopefully it will spur on a conversation about why we need to recenter the rights of human beings against corporations. So that's kind of one hope that I'm holding out for.
I'm quite pessimistic, merely because if you saw what happened over the IP bill, the Investigatory Powers Bill, which was passed recently, like with barely a whimper, and that basically legalised what Snowden had revealed. So Snowden's revelations showed that PRISM and other programs could just basically do a Google search of your private email accounts and Facebook accounts. And the IP bill, seeing that, just said, well, before we have a leaker, let's legalise it so we can... And no one has said anything about it. That gives power to the police to search your internet history with not even a suspicion that you've made a crime. Now, if that can happen and no one really raises a finger, what hope do we have that people are actually going to care that their information is getting mined off to different corporations? I don't know if there's going to be a tipping point. I don't really understand why people don't care, but it's probably because it hasn't actually flipped into real-world consequences yet. But as you say, it will, and it has, but in a way that's indirect enough that people can't trace the causality.
Yeah, well, the whole point is that they've been hiding kind of what they're capable of. So I think it's probably going to be quite shocking when people start to see it having an effect on their daily lives. However, it is still secretive. We don't know how they make these decisions. But yeah, as you said earlier, people are getting more used to their social media profiles being looked at by employers and other things that will affect your financial standing. We're going to finish with a last bit from Usha Ramanathan, and here she's talking about how these kinds of biometric ID schemes and other data mining pushes a presumption of guilt upon the public, and they're forced to kind of prove their innocence against forces like corporations who haven't had a good track record themselves.
Reporting to the state is the central part of this, on the basis that if we don't want to do it, this country is full of corrupt people, black marketeers, black money hoarders, money launderers, terrorists. So if you refuse, and if you say, why on earth are you asking us to do this? It is only because you are corrupt and you want to say, protect your corruption. So this categorization of a whole population as all of these things, unless they prove themselves otherwise regularly, I think that's been one of the most ugly parts of this project. Because the state talking about its people like this, it's been really tragic. And also it's interesting because just prior to this project coming into being, you have, take the previous 10 years, say 2000 to 2010, and you'll see that there are major scams that came out. And all those scams were about collaborative scams between politicians, bureaucrats, and corporates. And then they will sit now and monitor that we are good, clean, harmless people. Mm-hmm. So think about what it means. This is the project.